Hi, my name is Ryan Back.
And I'm Nicole Barlow.
And this is Soundtrack Your Life, where we speak with guests about a soundtrack that is important to them. Today, our guest is the host of the Niccstalgia Podcast, Nicole Tremaglio. Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you guys so much for having me.
We're excited to talk to you, and today we are talking about the year 2000 Mick G directed film, Charlie's Angels. So, Nicole, why are we talking about Charlie's Angels today?
Yeah, Charlie's Angels is one of my favorite movie soundtracks. I had it when I was younger, and it was a CD that I just absolutely played out. I think that it is a great job at really depicting the 20-year trend cycle. It's a perfect example of that playing out because you see a lot of the 70s influence and a lot of the disco influence from the late 90s into the early 2000s. And so I grew up with listening to some of these more classic rock songs, but then getting introduced to a new genre of music, and also the movie just being pretty emblematic as well. I guess we'll get to the fact that it's a product of its time, but I think it's also emblematic of the wave of, I guess, post-second wave of feminism, Spice Girls-esque girl power feminism. And so it's really interesting to see that movie and that soundtrack looking back on it.
It is. Do you think that this is maybe one of the most deeply Y2K films and film soundtracks? Because for me, I can hear like a Carson Daly intro.
It's so funny because people will say, oh, All the Small Things was just played in the ending credits. Why was it not on the soundtrack? It should have been on the soundtrack, because you do kind of get that feeling like this should be on the set of MTV's Spring Break in 2000 for some reason.
Yeah, I was surprised that like MTV Films was not like a producer of this movie.
I checked 3 times and like it has to be. It has to be. But does this film like predate the existence of MTV Films as a production company? Maybe it does. I don't know.
I don't think so.
I would say maybe they are concurrent to an extent, because I'm trying to remember off the top of my head any MTV films that come to mind. I'm like, was Crossroads, was Glitter, was
film with Jerry McConnell. Anyway, I think it was probably concurrent, but it's weird that it wasn't just straight up made by MTV. I think we're going to be forced to talk about Mick G a lot, and Mick G is, of course, it started as a music video director, and this is his debut film. And it is basically a series of like cool little music videos.
Definitely. I mean, he's directed dozens of music videos, and some of my favorites, not that they're my favorite music videos. It's when I say favorite, I don't mean the song or the music video is actually a favorite. I mean that I just am very amused at the fact that Mick G, who I know first and foremost as an executive producer of the OC,
right?
You know, and he himself is Orange County born and bred, and you know, best friends with Mark McGrath of Sugar Ray, etc. So it's like he directed Every Morning, Fly, When It's Over. He did Walking on the Sun and All Star from Smash Mouth, and then Pretty Fly for a White Guy, and Why Don't You Get a Job for The Offspring, and finally 1 Week by the Bare Naked Ladies. It's like all of those songs just represent such a specific slice of Orange County-esque music, ska adjacent, late 90s feel. And so I feel like whatever he does is really on the nose in that way. It fits just like this particular niche that we ended up seeing evolve from the 90s, kind of like No Doubt, Gwen Stefani also being from Orange County, like that ska. I can't say post-punk. I can't say punk in the same sentence as Mick G and Gwen Stefani, but just like seeing the evolution from this Californian idolized kind of style of music and fashion from the late 90s, and then it kind of transforming into the OC and like the Hollister brand of Californian that we knew as teenagers in the 2000s, that transition that he was kind of a part of both movements separately. That's a very interesting line of continuity that he draws.
Nicole, are you from Orange County by chance? Because that it's almost hurtful.
I am from Connecticut, so I am in no way from California. I've gotten it before where people are like, "Oh my God, are you like from LA or whatever?" I could totally see you being from California. I'm like, is it because I'm the most chill of the not chill people? Because that could be it. I love a California attitude, but I am very very East Coast over here.
Yeah, apologies to my Connecticut friends, but you don't read. I'm not getting Connecticut right now, but that Hollister reference is much like this film and much like everything McGee, just deeply, deeply Orange County. And I'm like born and raised Orange County, so I feel like I can say that with confidence.
McGee and I share the same alma mater.
Oh, really?
Yep, UC Irvine.
That's amazing.
Deeply Orange County.
Like the most Orange County thing that you can be is like a graduate of UCI.
I don't know.
So really, Chapman. Like this hits close to home for you guys, literally.
Oh yeah, in like a bunch of different ways.
That's exciting. What do you think is the thing you have the most in common with McGee, if anything? I guess other than your school.
I mean, I also wanted to direct music videos at one point in my life.
I would also like to make Sam Rockwell dance around like a weird little guy.
Yeah,
these fantasies we didn't.
I feel like I feel like whoever casted him for Iron Man 2 watched Charlie's Angels and was like, just do that again.
100. Like, I feel like they get a lot of mileage out of people, dancing in kind of like goofy but cool ways in this movie. I think Sam Rockwell dancing to Simon Says is kind of for me, like the definitive takeaway musically from this.
And I also walked out at my wedding reception to Simon Says.
Did you?
Wait, really?
Weird, I don't remember that, but I believe it. I might have been drinking.
It was definitely part of the wedding party introductions.
That's hilarious. I feel like, too, a lot of people kind of just having read a few different articles or a few different retrospectives on this soundtrack to really just kind of reflect on like, okay, I know what my memory is of actually listening to the soundtrack, but I always like to examine the past through a contemporary lens. So it's like, okay, having a little bit of context and perspective and just time. I mean, that movie came out 24 years ago. Kind of what's the perception? What was it then versus what is it now? And one of the things that people mentioned was that, okay, yes, there's the contemporary influence with Destiny's Child. There's a lot of the 70s music, but then there's also what people would call like, quote, weird songs, whether it's like the Fatboy Slim song or the Charlie's Angels 2000 instrumental track or Tangerine Speedo. And it's like, I do appreciate that little, they're like, okay, we kept it either nostalgic or current throughout the whole soundtrack, and then we're just going to end it weird.
There's a little bit of like Tarantino light, I feel, in some of the weird tracks that are a little bit more left of center and a little unexpected. There's also this weird thing, Ryan and I were talking about this before we hopped on, but there's this weird thing with like the reworked Charlie's Angels theme that has this like sample of Smack Your Bitch Up by the Prodigy. Smack my bitch up. Which is just so strange to me. Like it hits you in a really strange way. Like they couldn't put that whole song into something that's like this commercial, but they could take the sample and that was fine.
Yeah, I think that. So Ryan has rewatched the movie recently. I guess I can count this as rewatching the movie, but it is not available for free streaming anywhere that I found. Yeah. I went through my whole physical media renaissance and had a project last year where I would basically go to library sales and thrift particular DVDs and CDs that I sought out from my childhood, whether I had it or whatever. And so I have a little mini collection, and I never bought Charlie's Angels, the movie. The soundtrack, I would like to reacquire that. My mom's like, why are you buying all this stuff you had 20 years? I'm like, it's part of a project. It's research. It's my job. This is literally work. This is the work that I do. But yeah, I didn't have the DVD or anything of this, and I'm like, I'm not paying to watch Charlie's Angels again. So I found it on YouTube, but it's 720 pixels or whatever. So not amazing quality. It's also sped up 3 times. And so I'm like, great, I'll have just enough time to watch this whole movie, but it's in 3 times the speed.
That's the way McGee intended it.
Right? I'm like, this feels subversive in a way. I guess my point in bringing that up was like, yeah, and sampling the Prodigy, it's like this movie was, again, so post-90s, but pre-girl boss feminism, where it's like, yeah, look how these girls rock. Look how they kick people's ass. But like, yeah, not actually in a way that... It's hard to explain, I guess, in like that it really wasn't groundbreaking in any kind of way, especially because it was a rehash of a 70s TV show. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is that the sampling of that song, in that like it seems empowering, but it is deeply not. I feel the same way about this movie.
Oh yeah, totally
there's
agree.
a weird thing with 20-year trend cycles that you were saying, right? Where it's like, if you compare it to, I'm sure, like Charlie's Angels of the 70s, probably feels like pretty revolutionary. But it's also really stuck in this Y2K time capsule. It's got moments where you feel like, okay, like they're deeply in control of the situation. There's a really good sequence with Lucy Liu where Barracuda by Heart is playing, which I feel like is just kind of like, it's like a stand-in for like, now you're going to see something badass. And it gets used like over and over again in movies and TV and commercials. My friends just licensed it for a Hyundai spot. It's just like one of those tracks where I feel like music is almost the stand-in for like, okay, no, empowerment, right?
And with a random Melissa McCarthy cameo as well.
Such a random weird cameo that I didn't remember, but I have to confess, I watched this in sort of like clips. I didn't watch the whole movie, but I've seen it before. I feel like you don't really need to rewatch it.
No, if anyone's listening who's like, should I go rewatch the movie now? No, I would actively suggest that you don't, and you save your time doing something else.
That's maybe the first time somebody said that on this podcast. Like, actually, the movie that I'm covering today, like, don't watch that.
No, like, you can listen to the soundtrack if you want, but to actually watch the movie, you really don't have to.
If you remember the trailer, you have seen all you need from the movie.
Factual. Yes.
Yeah, I think that Barracuda being used kind of as this empowerment anthem, I thought in this particular movie, it was like, okay, we're going to show these women like being badass and them kind of like going undercover and infiltrating this tech company. But the fact of the matter is like that was still pushing a boundary back then. And I mean, I guess that's good to know that we have made progress or strides in that, like, maybe there would be one woman working at a tech. I guess Melissa McCarthy was the only woman that worked at a tech company in the year 2000.
It's just her.
It was
just
Melissa
her.
McCarthy and then the Sam Rockwell's partner as the president of his company.
Oh, well, that's good. See,
so
I
we
watched
got a
the
girl
movie
in the C-suite, you know?
I watched the movie on 3 times speed, so I think it just flew right by her.
You missed the Kelly Lynch. Lynch.
Yeah. I will say for the past 24 years, if someone mentioned Charlie's Angels, immediately that intro of Independent Women would start playing in my head. With, with my girl Drew, Lucy Liu, Cameron D, and Destiny. Like that
yes.
spoken intro has like just been burned into my memory for the past.
Like if you came of age, it like in this era, that there's no way to escape that. Like it's an inescapable, for better and worse. You're gonna remember it. That video is great, by the way, that music video where like Destiny's Child is like training in like the Charlie's Angels facility and they're doing all that kind of like by wire, like martial arts shit. It's so funny. It's so dumb.
First of all, this was a very 90s, early 2000s thing where like there were so many videos that were on movie soundtracks that were just basically comprised of all movie clips. Like if you think about Princess Diaries or Legally Blonde, like there are, right, like I think it's Hoku's Perfect Day music video. It's all Legally Blonde clips dispersed throughout the video. And the theme of the video is that the video is on the soundtrack for a movie, which is so silly.
It's so silly, but it like was perfectly of its time. I think my favorite example of that is there's this movie called Deep Blue Sea from 1999 where like people go to like a shark scientist island to try to find a cure for Alzheimer's, and LL Cool J is in it. And there's
He's
a song,
in this movie too,
right? And so, it was huge, right? Like, he was huge at this time, and he had this song called Deep Blue Sea, and it's kind of like this, we're like stuck in my mind forever. It's like deepest, bluest, my head is like a shark's fin. No one remembers that but me, but I think about it like once a month.
Any LL Cool J production, they're like, get this on a movie soundtrack immediately.
Right. Green
Put
light.
this man in the movie. Green light.
It's just like this, right? Where like this Destiny's Child song is like the song that's going to win like the MTV Movie Awards, like best song from a movie. Like it's a kind of like a built-in system at this point.
Yeah. You know what's funny? I read somewhere that independent women, because Charlie's Angels came out in 2000 and Destiny's Child's Survivor album didn't come out until 2001. And so Independent Women was going to be, or it was on their album Survivor, but like after it had already been on the Charlie's Angels soundtrack. So apparently that Beyonce's dad, who was also their manager, apparently he submitted the song to the Charlie's Angels soundtrack without Beyonce. Well, I guess, and everybody else, but mostly Beyonce, like without her actually knowing anything about that. So I'm like, that kind of sounds like something Beyonce's parents would do. But what I also think is interesting is that this was the first Destiny's Child song to feature Michelle Williams on it, because they had LaToya, they were out, they brought in Michelle, and they brought in this other girl, Farrah. Farrah was only there for, which is funny because Farrah Fawcett was one of the original Charlie's Angels. But yeah, Farrah was in for 6 months, then she was out, and you can see her in the Say My Name music video, which is a very iconic music video. But what's so funny, because I went to rewatch Say My Name, is that when they go and they switch back and forth between all these rooms in different colors, there's like a bunch of girls in each room posing. So they obviously zoom in on Beyonce while she's singing. They zoom in on Kelly. They'll zoom in on Michelle, but they don't ever zoom in on Farrah. So I'm like, I wonder if that music video came out after she had left the band, or if they had to re-edit it or whatever. But actually, my very core memory about Independent Women Part 1 specifically is that I grew up dancing. Dance was my whole life, and some people would get to do like a duet, a trio, a quartet, you know, with a small group of other dancers. And so I was in a trio with two other girls, and we did a dance. How old am I? I'm in like 5th or 6th grade, and we were doing a dance to Independent Women Part 1. And we walk onto the stage at the beginning where it's like Lucy Liu, and then like I hit a pose, and then it's like with my girl Drew, and the other girl hits a pose, Cameron D, like, you know, and I'm like, wow. So I'm Lucy Liu in that trio, and that song, I just remember at the time it being, I don't know, there was just like drama, you know, when you're that age and there's just, it's like middle school drama, but then we're dancing to this song all about like, yeah, independent women. And I'm in 6th grade. I'm like, I am so not an independent woman right now. I'm a fraud.
I love that, though. There are a lot of very like danceable tracks on this. Like they get a lot of mileage out of Sam Rockwell grooving around, Cameron Diaz grooving around more than once to Heaven Must Be Missing an Angel. You had this on CD. So aside from Independent Women, were there tracks that you would just like put on and really enjoy? Like what's your memory of having that on physical media, Nicole?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up with classic rock, so Barracuda was already a song I knew very well. And that was also one of the tracks, because at this point, when I was about 7 years old, that was when I really started listening to my own music. Before that, I only listened to my parents' music. So I grew up on Queen and Led Zeppelin and the Beatles. And by the time the Charlie's Angels soundtrack came out, it was kind of like, okay, put that in your Walkman. Like, we're not listening to that on the boombox. We're not listening to that in the car. I kind of had to keep it to myself. But Barracuda was a song that everybody wanted to listen to. So that was good. Also, Groove is in the Heart is just one of my favorite songs of all time. And another core memory was that in high school, we had a junior fashion show. And so all of the juniors would, I mean, it's exactly what it sounds like. It was like the OC, but not a debutante ball. It was just like in our high school auditorium. But I was this huge Delia's girl. And so I wore a white t-shirt with the Velvet Underground, like Bananas by Andy Warhol. It was like a banana screen printed t-shirt with a very thick red patent leather headband, a very thick patent leather red belt, like a non-functional belt, with black, I guess you would call them skinny jeans, but we called them cigarette pants, kind of in like an Audrey Hepburn style, because I was like obsessed with Audrey Hepburn, and red ballet flats, also patent leather. And you got to pick what song you walked out, the runway onto. And I chose Groove is in the Heart because I'm like, this song, that is me in a song. And its aesthetic is very representative of what, and I talk about them on my podcast like every single day, but the Consumer Aesthetics Research Institute, they coined this term called groovival. And so it's kind of like a groovy revival of that 60s flower power culture in the 90s. And Deee-Lite, that band, perfectly exemplifies it, where they wear go-go boots. And I mean, that very much went to influence kind of 90s clubbing culture as well. But whenever I hear that song, you can't help but be in a good mood.
Slide Whistle it's so infectious. Groove is in the Heart is also one of my favorite songs. So we are kindred in this way. It was such a big thing when I was like in my early 20s that we would go to clubs and we would like request it from the DJ. Like we would get really lit. And then at some point somebody would go up to the DJ and see like if they would play it. So I've had like this happened like in Jersey once, like in Edinburgh, Scotland. Like I've like literally like every club that I would go to, I'm like, can you play Groove is in the Heart? And then we would be ridiculous to it because it's so fun.
It brings people together wherever you are in the world.
Yeah, it's such a good track.
It does. If I couldn't be alive in the 70s to experience disco, then I can be, a little elementary school kid listening to my Charlie's Angels soundtrack, because my parents really weren't into disco. And so I ended up, when I was 18, I worked so Abercrombie & Fitch had an underwear store called Gilly Hicks, and their entire soundtrack was just like absolutely, how in Abercrombie and Hollister, how like blaringly loud those songs were. And so this store played all disco music. And so I would just be dancing around to disco music all day. And so I feel like this soundtrack might have been my first introduction to disco music. Heaven Must Be Missing an Angel, You Make Me Feel Like Dancing. This was before I had seen 16 Candles, but when I was in high school, I went through like a huge John Hughes phase and heard the song True played prominently in 16 Candles, and then later realized, oh yeah, that song was on the Charlie's Angels soundtrack, which is kind of a funny connection to make.
I can't believe you worked at the Abercrombie disco underwear store. Like, that's a memory hole. I don't remember that. I don't remember that existing on the West Coast. It probably did.
It might have somewhere, and I can't remember when the store ended up closing. They ended up kind of relaunching it inside of a Hollister store because when I lived in New York City, there was one kind of in a Hollister store, and I'm like, what is happening right now? It needs to be its own like 20,000 square foot, extremely dark, extremely fragrant, extremely loud experience. Like, that's half of it. No, that's all of it. It's the experience.
Maybe they need to start doing pop-up stores of it. Bring it back.
have it just be like a one night disco. I also found out too, which I thought was very strange, that True was also in the Drew Barrymore movie 50 First Dates, and it was covered by will.i.am and Fergie. And so I listened to it and I'm like, what's this gonna sound like? And then I did, and I'm like, oh, it sounds like if will.i.am and Fergie covered 1983 song True for the Drew Barrymore film 50 First Dates. That's exactly whatever you think it sounds like. It sounds exactly like that.
My head is trying to process all that information, and I don't think
it's a lot. It's, spoiler alert, it's not good.
Well, like you've been saying too, I think that Charlie's Angels soundtrack is kind of like nostalgia within nostalgia. It's sort of like a nesting doll of nostalgia, because it's got 70s, and then it's got the 70s making this resurgence in the
90s.
late 90s.
Yep.
And kind of coming to like a new prominence and popularity in fashion and culture, in music. I hate to keep talking about Sam Rockwell dancing, but I feel like I have to, because it's kind of all he does in this film is like slink around in like a tank top. I don't know. Marvin Gaye's like got to give it up when he gets revealed as like the villain and this kind of twist, and he's just sort of like shuffling his feet to that song. Also kind of like a great.
Yeah, you know what? Actually, I realized my favorite song from that soundtrack that I didn't know before that I like now is Brandy by Looking Glass. And so
Tom Green.
The version on the Charlie's Angels soundtrack has Tom Green singing the chorus in like his really bad singing voice. Right? And I didn't know, when you're listening to the soundtrack and you're like, oh, okay. Like, I hate those monologues. Like, hurry up and get to the song.
Right.
But for some reason, because the first time I had ever heard that song was on the Charlie's Angels soundtrack, I remember later hearing it without the Tom Green singing at the beginning and being like, wait a second. That's not part of the real song.
And then one day you heard the original version, you were like, wait.
Here I was for, 15 years thinking the Tom Green singing part was really a part of the song, and it's absolutely not. Right? Like, it was probably when I was making my yacht rock playlist on Spotify, because I like listening to, it feels very comforting to me that all of the songs that play in the grocery store, and this still stands true because I went to the grocery store yesterday and Shazammed a song, because it all still sounds like 80s music. And it's okay if Smooth by Santana featuring Rob Thomas plays. That's fine, because I was still a kid when that song came out. But like, the fact that all of the songs that play in the grocery store still make me feel like how I did when I was a kid, I'm like, all of these songs could be AI. And I wouldn't even know it. But as long as they sound like with that same familiar, just like sonically they sound familiar, I am totally okay with that.
Oh, that's what they're banking on.
Well, I think it's really funny, because a lot of millennials think that nostalgia marketing is new, and it's not. And everyone's like, oh, I'm so sick of nostalgia. Or there's a word nostalgia too to describe that phenomenon for people who were not around the first time. Like, I didn't experience the 70s. I have nostalgia for the 70s. My mom has nostalgia for the 70s. And I talk about kind of a meta nostalgia concept where, like we're saying, now I have nostalgia for the early 2000s and the late 90s. But then my version of that, nested within that, is also the revival of the 70s. And so it's like, it just keeps getting more and more meta. And I don't think that it's nostalgia that we're sick of. It's just capitalism that we're sick of. And it's like the resentment that the same ideas are rehashed when like our stated preference is novelty, but our unstated need is familiarity. And familiarity is a surefire way to make money. And I think we're all just getting a little frustrated that people marketing products and movies and etc. know that. And so as much as we say, we want something new, we want something original. Okay, why did this movie that was a 25 5-year-old rehash of a 70s television show make $250 million. Clearly you do like nostalgia. Clearly you do like familiarity. And clearly you do like something that's already been done before, because that's what you're spending your money on.
Yeah, I mean, look at the Barbie movie, right? Like a perfect example of something that everybody knows that is like fundamentally built on a form of nostalgia, I think. But it's done so well that you can embrace it, that on its own merit, it's also a great piece of like new media and new creativity. So I think that's where like I can see both sides of it. Like nobody wants things that like feel lazy or feel rehashed or feel like your youth is being sold back to you like in some, you know, very callous sort of Hollywood way. But
yeah, there are definitely the different sides to it. And I think I refer to this phenomenon as the chasm, right? Where you reach a certain age and then this stuff that you recognize starts coming back and you're like, wait a second. You're telling me that I'm old enough to see the completion of a trend cycle. I'm old enough to recognize things. And now younger people, there's a different fixture generation of youth culture, and you realize that you've been edged out. So then you get mad about it, because what does it remind you of? Of mortality and aging and all of those systems, you know, and the powers that be that are like, don't age, you know, stay this way forever. I think that's kind of like the, I don't know. I really try to stay positive when it comes to nostalgia while fully understanding that there is a shadow side and a dark side. And people often equate Hollywood and actors and people who have this fame or power or money with morality. And it's like, no. You can't do that, because you will look back and always be disappointed. And so, yeah, there's definitely nuance in like, okay, yeah, maybe I will go buy a CD that I had 20 years ago, but there's a way, but like I'm seeking that out on my own. I don't feel patronized in a way that nostalgia marketing sometimes is executed. Something else that I thought was kind of interesting about Charlie's Angels. So I actually mistakenly remembered, I guess this is the one good thing about me rewatching the movie, is that I mistakenly thought that at the very beginning of the movie, when Cameron Diaz is dancing in her bedroom, that famous scene to the rest of Heaven Must Be Missing an Angel before she greets the package guy, I thought that was the part when she was dancing to Baby Got Back. But then I realized that when she was dancing to Baby Got Back was later in the movie. However, what I find weird about that is that if you go to Wikipedia, Baby Got Back has been removed from the track listing and replaced by Boom Shake the Room by DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince. And I'm sure it was some kind of licensing or legal thing, but like, I want to know why. Because Baby Got Back is on the original physical media soundtrack.
Oh, so you're saying, and it's in the movie, right? When she dances at the Soul Train thing, which is a whole other conversation.
Which is a whole
which is never explained how they end up there. Like he's like, I'm gonna get tickets, right. And then you're like, oh, movie, concert.
Well, also even the concept of Cameron Diaz being like, I'm gonna dance to Baby Got Back, because in the 2000s, like any ass was a big ass to people. Like I have a lot more to say about that is for a different show. But so it's on the streaming version of the soundtrack is a different song, but in the movie, it's Baby Got Back.
Like if you look at a physical back of a CD, it says track number 6, Baby Got Back. And if you go on Wikipedia right now, it'll say track number 6, Boom Shake the Room. And I'm like, huh? I don't remember if that song was in the movie, but I know that Baby Got Back was in the movie. So then when I went and watched the beginning and it was the end of Heaven Must Be Missing an Angel, I was like, wait, did they take Baby Got Back out of the movie? Well, no, they didn't. It was in a later part.
It's probably a licensing thing. I think one of the real crimes of streaming versus physical media is that there are a lot of different films and TV shows that on streaming have completely different needle drops. Like Scrubs, for example, a show kind of like built on like needle drops. And if you stream it, all of the songs are different because there's not the ability to get the same licensing that they arranged for the original show. So you have it on DVD, it's one thing, and then you have it on streaming and it's something very different. So yeah, physical media, guys, get into it.
Yeah, I mean, especially because a lot of things you can get at, like, there's a thrift store in town that I go to and I will check back. I mean, the DVD turnover is pretty low in that particular location, so I don't have to worry about something getting snatched up. But yeah, there are so many places where you can get a DVD for literally $1. Like, you don't even need to go on eBay and spend $20 on a VHS box set of whatever TV show, because at least in my experience, there's been a high likelihood in finding it again. I got, as much as I didn't watch it when it originally aired, I did end up getting, and I don't like to spontaneously buy things. I like to have my hit list, and I like to have things that I know have sentimental value or a particular rarity, in that, like, if this was removed from streaming, I would be very upset about it, because we've seen that happen over the years. And I found a box set of season 1 of Beverly Hills 90210. And someone told me that that is another example of a show where the music is completely different. And then I think about the OC, which was really like my generation's 90210. And like, I can't imagine what that show would be if it didn't have the exact songs that it had. And the music supervision on that show, I just admire so much, because it really defined, it didn't just define the taste of that era, but it went on to influence it further as well.
It's important. I mean, I feel like we've been talking about physical media more and more on this podcast, but, you know, Daria, things like Daria and Beavis and Butthead, right? Without the original music and music videos that Beavis and Butthead talk about, they're like kind of unwatchable. And it's really unfortunate that this is this kind of important like cultural artifact that we're just straight up losing. So again, maybe a different podcast, but I feel like the Charlie's Angels soundtrack being one thing in physical media and something else in streaming is also like, there's a little bit of like a loss there as we get like further into time and further into like examining what the intentions behind this particular curation really were. And it's such wall-to-wall music too. Like, even more so than a normal blockbuster. Like, there's so many songs in this movie.
I was going through, you know, just a list of songs that are in the movie that are not on the soundtrack. And you have, you know, obviously we have Blink-182, all the small things that ends the movie, but you have Korn and Wham and Motley Crue, and there's so many huge bands that are on here, like Joan Jett and the Blackhearts, and you have the Prodigy, which we mentioned before, and now Sir Mix-a-Lot has been moved to that section of the Wikipedia page. But there's so many big songs, you know, from Michael Jackson to the Pizzicato 5, which is a very, very like niche indie band. There's just so much music just jam-packed into the sound, or not soundtrack, but into the movie in general. Another reason why it kind of feels like it should be like an MTV film, because there's just so much music from so many different genres. The person who is the soundtrack supervisor, his name is John Houlihan. And he's gone on to do like the John Wick movies and the Deadpool movies as well. And I feel like he has like a specific touch when it comes like to these blockbusters and jumping around genre a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's kind of a flex if you can get the licensing for that many, like not just the quality of the songs. Michael Jackson is an obvious example there, but like the sheer quantity. I think there's literally 15 songs on this soundtrack. It is a full-length album that spans, at least in the context of the early 2000s, like practically every genre.
For sure. And like so many soundtracks, there are also a lot of things that are not included on it, but they pop up in the film. So when you take it all together, it's a lot of music. And it must have been like a huge undertaking, even with probably a fairly sizable budget to get this all done. So yeah, I think like Ryan, you said, it takes like a very specific like touch and ability to kind of genre hop. And you can really see that come through in this soundtrack. and it seems successful on that front.
Right. And even though there's a mix of genres, there's still these different threads of continuity. And a fun fact that I read is the Fatboy Slim song "Ya Mama" that's on the soundtrack was also in a trailer for Spy Kids. And I'm like, wait, that's so random, but like it actually also makes
also not
perfect sense.
Yeah. Completely.
Spy Kids was kind of like the new Charlie's Angels, like an action. Okay, no. Well, no, but yes. I don't know. There's parallels.
I see similarities. It's like the junior version, maybe.
It's the junior version.
And Robert Rodriguez directed it, right? And he's pals with Tarantino. And
right.
You can see him, wanting to have like that same sort of needle drop sort of reputation.
And I think that's important too. Like a lot of soundtracks of this era, we're all kind of aiming ultimately for the same thing, which is, you want to create needle drop moments that I think give your film a longer shelf life, right? Tarantino was doing that. This film does that. There are moments that, absent of being able to like stream things immediately that kind of stick in your brain. I mean, even like many, many years later, like having not watched this film again for the podcast, which I normally do, but I'm like, I don't need to because it's like wallpapered in my brain from like a very formative time. It's very memorable.
Yeah, there's a song that is on this soundtrack that is by Aerosmith, and it's called Angel's Eye, which I'm like, okay, that's very on the nose.
But it worked. The IndyCar race, right?
Exactly. And so in the same way that Barracuda is like, okay, if that song starts playing, something's going down. It's the same thing with Angel's Eye. And this is one of, those songs that you just have to go to YouTube for because it's not on streaming. This is one of them. It was released as a promotional single and written for this movie. And so I grew up listening to Aerosmith. And so this was another one of those songs where it's like, all right, it's time to rock.
Right. Sexy ladies are going to appear.
Driving race cars, just like doing what they do.
Jumping off like bridges, like Alicia Silverstone.
Over by San Pedro.
Yeah. Like, I don't know.
I know where that bridge is.
What's so funny? Recently, what music video was I watching? I was watching some music video and I was like, wait a second. This setting looks like where they filmed Grease. And so they filmed Grease, like that car racing scene, over at I think it's called like the LA River or something. You guys, would know the Los Angeles things more specifically probably than me.
Bridge, LA River, like there's a lot of stuff that gets filmed there like over and over and over again. It's like a very iconic spot for movies and commercials.
Yeah. You know what? It might have been Wherever You Will Go by The Calling, because sometimes I just love watching early 2000s music videos. And a friend of mine who was a reporter at Billboard calls it minivan rock, and that's probably what Spotify has also categorized it as. I have a Spotify playlist that's called Meg Songs because my friend Meg specifically loves these early 2000s adult contemporary adult like indie alternative songs. So when you think of like Wherever You Will Go by The Calling, Matchbox 20,
Goo Goo Dolls.
Yes, Goo Goo Dolls. Exactly. Like you already know exactly the niche. And so, you have some songs from the 90s like Hootie and the Blowfish that kind of were predecessors to this. And then anyway, so I'm watching Wherever You Will Go music video by The Calling. And I go, wait, isn't that where Grease, the car racing scene, was filmed? And it was at the Los Angeles River. And so I look up on Wikipedia. Okay, well, it can't just only be those two things. It has to be more. Don'tcha by the Pussycat Dolls and Down by Blink-182 were also filmed there, which I just think is so important. And I've been to LA a couple times, but the first time I ever went to downtown LA, my friend was like, okay, that is where they filmed Michelle Branch's Everywhere music video. And you start looking at all the street corners and being like, oh my God, I'm in a late 90s, early 2000s adult contemporary indie rock music video. You just start seeing everything differently and you're like, oh, now it makes sense.
I think that's an example of like an unintentional aesthetic that got created just based on like low budgets. Because if you're producing like in the LA area, like it's pretty cheap.
Especially downtown LA during that time.
Right. Like it wouldn't have been expensive just because I work in production. Like it wouldn't have been expensive to shoot it there. And I think what accidentally ended up happening is that like, oh shit, everything looks like that. Because it's got the same kind of like gray tones, probably like very similar, you know, like color grading and feel. And yeah, no, you're totally right. I've never thought of it in the context of like minivan rock music videos, but you're absolutely spot on.
I'm like, wait, that's implying that people that listen, like the Gen X crowd is like old now, which like don't go talking about people like that. But I feel like it's different when it's your parents. You're like, yeah, but then when people who are younger than your parents start getting called old, you're like, hey. I mean, I personally, granted, like being in the nostalgia niche, being a cultural critic of the nostalgia niche, I know a lot of these content creators, and I know that a lot of meme accounts, for example, it's like that's something that is a little bit inflammatory to talk about, right? Because again, no one wants to think about their mortality and no one wants to think about their obsolescence or anything like that. However, it's a topic that always gets people talking and like, what? I feel old, or, oh, don't you feel old now? And I personally am like, I never feel old, to be honest with you, but that's because I always lead with curiosity and play and fun. And so if I mean, I'm sitting here talking to you right now and you can see my Ginger Spice poster behind me on my wall.
That
and like,
rocks. That's so cool.
Thank you.
Is it signed?
It's signed. I got to meet her a couple months ago and it was absolutely amazing.
Wow.
Where did you meet her?
She actually wrote a book. She wrote a grade school, like a middle school grade, not a chapter book, a young adult fiction book. And so she was doing a book tour. I found out about her book tour literally a day before it was supposed to be happening. I missed the New York City one. She was in New Jersey that night, and then she was going to be on Long Island the next day. And I'm like, oh, I guess I'm going to Long Island. Got in the car and I'm like, let's go. Yeah, and got to meet her. And granted, it was a lot of waiting, but seeing everybody else kind of go up in line before you, and you were allowed to bring one piece of memorabilia for every book that you brought for her to sign. And so I gave my sister my Spice Girls lollipop for her to sign, and then I got my poster signed. And it's like, this is all just so special. And I feel like I used to work in the fashion industry too. So it's like there's a difference between being materialistic and gathering objects and being surrounded by objects versus having the objects around you. Not saying everything needs to have sentimental value. I'm like actually surprisingly not as sentimental maybe as you would think, but like it just adds a layer of richness to your life when you were just really thoughtful about designing, whether it's your space or your outfits that you wear. It's really reflective of you. And yeah, that kind of identity work really is like where everything I do stems from. How these songs that you listen to, how these movies that you watched shaped how you see the world and how you interact to and relate with other people, because ultimately it's shaped them as well.
Yeah, and I think like you said, it's really easy to look at a soundtrack like this and say like, oh shit, I feel so old recalling all of these songs and knowing that like I grew up with them. But I kind of look at them and I'm like, it's interesting to see the things that are still getting used and interpreted and reinterpreted like very much now, like the stuff that survives this kind of nostalgia trap and I think becomes more like classic or standard. Like Barracuda, right, is a great example of something that's like still heavily used today. All the Small Things by Blink-182. Blink-182 is having like a huge moment, and you can call it nostalgia, or maybe you can call it like that's something that's going to endure. I think that's kind of what I'm interested in seeing, like what endures beyond the people that originally were there for that thing.
Yeah, when I went to go see the Barbie movie in theaters, there was a commercial beforehand. I don't remember what the movie, but it was an animated movie. And they used the song Survivor by Destiny's Child
There you go.
on the soundtrack. And it's like, that band broke up how many ever years ago, but Beyonce is still one of the most famous people in the world. And you now have adults going to take their kids to go see this movie, and the adults are the ones that recognize that song. That's just nostalgia marketing. Like, there's not really, I don't know. I'm not saying there's not any harm in that, because the fact that everything is just done to make money is like a problem in and of itself. But like, that's okay. Like, you're still alive. Like, I don't know. That's kind of amazing.
Well, it's kind of this tactic of, we'll throw something there for the parents, so then it'll be easier for them to swallow it, to take their kids to see it.
Yeah, I mean, I saw Charlie's Angels, but I don't think I think I might have been a little too young to see it in the movie theater. So, and I can't imagine what parent would want to take me to see Charlie's Angels. So I'm like, I must have gotten it from Blockbuster or something.
You probably did. And also, I think something that gets not talked about enough is how it back in, like, I don't want to say our time, but like before streaming, pre-streaming, everything wasn't siloed off into like kids media, adult media, right? So like whatever your parents were seeing or whatever like your parents were picking up at Blockbuster, like you just pick something up. I saw so many movies that I should not have been seeing at like a young age, either because my parents were watching them or that my 12 years older sister was watching them. Ask me about how I watched Poltergeist when I was 6. That was not okay.
That sounds traumatizing.
But like for better and worse, right? Like you're watching things that are created by and maybe a little bit more adult, I think, pre-streaming than kids are now, where they're like super like walled off if you want them to be.
That's an interesting point that you make, because now, like with parental controls, for example, or like separate profiles on Netflix, you can even have a profile on Netflix only showing kids programming. And so that's very interesting. Although I do see it from the other side of the coin too, where like when we were younger, it was siloed in terms of ratings. Like I remember there was this website, I can't remember what it was called, and I would love to go back and find it, but there was a website where it would list all of these movies and their ratings. And granted, you do have to remember too, this was the early 2000s, so the internet was very early and new as well. But like, think of years maybe 2000 to 2003 or so. I would go on this website, find a movie that I wanted to see, and then show my mom the webpage, because it was like explaining the appropriateness level of a movie. So I would try to use that as evidence to let my mom let me see a PG-13 movie when I was 11 or 12.
Oh, well, you had good parents. That's the takeaway.
Well,
they gave a shit about what you were watching.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a pretty traditional family, and so like there was definitely, and again, this is kind of the times as well where there was like, I mean, I guess there's always kind of been widespread moral panic about something, but just definitely there was just this conservatism where it was like the early 2000s, like hedonism and like the whole kind of Paris Hilton. There's a very good book that I read about this called Toxic Women in the 2000s Tabloid Media by Sarah Didham, but she calls it the upskirt decade. And so like with the paparazzi and this and that kind of like party girl was in stark contrast to like the George W. Bush era years. And so the age that I am, my middle school, high school, college experiences are all, those 3 chunks were 3 different presidents. And my graduation years were election years. And so I think it's very interesting for me to look back at particular chunks of time. Oh, middle school was very this era. High school was very that era. It makes it easier to categorize, because I think when you're looking at a movie or a soundtrack, these pieces of media are not isolated. They're a product of their cultural zeitgeist. So you have to remember everything that was going on. What were cultural norms and what was the status quo? What were the values of our society? What were the conventions? And then if you decide to watch Charlie's Angels 2000, you'll look back and be like, oh, of course this movie would not be made now. It can't. That's not a bad thing. You also don't have to disown every single thing that came out 20 plus years ago. Otherwise, you would be disowning literally everything. But that's the nuance of pop culture, and not equating it with morality, just equating it with entertainment, because that's what it is.
And I think this movie and this soundtrack really is a product of its time, for sure.
Oh, absolutely.
I think that's the best way to describe it. And for us, or for me, I was graduating high school at this time. Like Y2K was like, oh shit, what's gonna happen to my adult future? Is the grid gonna go down? So like when I revisit this movie, the dominant emotion I have is like very Y2K anxiety about what it means to like come into yourself as an adult. This movie like feels also like super geared to the male gaze, which is very of its time,
and
right?
also very
like,
Mick G.
I mean, it's Mick G, right? Like it's making an attempt at feminism, but it's a very 2000s attempt at feminism.
Yeah, it'd be different if it was like Spike Jonze directing it.
Right. So there's probably an exercise in there about how it might have been different with like a different director, but this director really, I think, it's very much concerned with like the aesthetics of, we're gonna make Cameron Diaz like dance around in some underoos.
Yeah, we're going to make that race car thing look really cool. Like, I'm going to shoot the tires at this angle. We're going to use a ton of green screen, too much green screen.
Yeah, that kind of like CGI effect was very popular in like this new way in the 2000s that I'm not saying it was that much more technologically advanced or anything, but right, as we were kind of saying before, it is a poor example of anything that can be hailed as a win for feminism. And then I also think that in this movie, there's so many cultural insensitivities and there's no intersectionality in, like, I can't even argue that this is any kind of feminist statement, even if you want to yell girl power. And listen, I was the biggest Spice Girls fan ever, obviously, as you know now. But like, there's a difference when it's like geared toward kids versus like this Charlie's Angels movie is not geared toward teenage girls. It's geared toward an adult male, and that's kind of gross to me now. I just didn't realize that at the time, being so young. So yeah, not only is it not a feminist statement, I'm not saying that it had to be or anything. The original, funny enough, I feel like things from the 70s you expect to have aged worse than things from the 2000s, and things from the 2000s will age worse every time because you think back and you think, oh, well, we should have known better by now. Oh, no, we didn't. We got the absolute worst of the last 50 years. And then, yeah, because there's no intersectionality in it as well, that's kind of disappointing. And when even like, I mean, we hadn't mentioned yet that like Turning Japanese by the Vapors is on this soundtrack. And that's a song where like, okay, that's from 1980. That song was already 20 years old by that point. And even if the band denies it having any kind of either like a sexual meaning or like a racial meaning, like even if the band says we didn't intend, it's just supposed to be a silly song about being surprised or unexpected or caught off guard. Cause like, and like, what a great way to put it in Charlie's Angels. Cause like, look at them. They're so crazy. They're driving race cars. They're ordering a lot of food in the drive-in. Like they're so crazy. But the fact of the matter is like, even back then, that was a little, I would consider, in my opinion, like a little bit in bad taste, even in 2000. So especially just due to, right, they make so many comments and there are so many scenes where you're like, this is just not it. So I think that
are very fetishized in this movie.
Yes,
so
yes.
You have like this group of women that's in control of their situation, but on the other you have this gaze. It's like it's very fetishy. So
a lot of ass shots in this movie.
Was that?
There's a lot of ass shots in this movie.
Like so like gratuitous amount of ass shots, right? Again, like back at a time where it's like we're all listening to Baby Got Back, but like everybody also needs to be like Paris Hilton thin, which is it was a very weird time to like come of age with like all of the, if you didn't grow up like as like an adolescent or like a young adult in this time, it's like impossible to like underplay how shitty it was to be like, oh, no, you need to like whittle yourself down to 90 pounds so you can wear low-rise jeans and have like a whale tail thong.
Yeah, you know, it was very interesting. I truly loved all of the 90s teenage coming of age films, like 10 Things I Hate About You and She's All That, and even Can't Hardly Wait, which also didn't age very well. But the point is that because I was a little bit younger, it's like your babysitter, right? You look up to these kids that are in high school, and a lot of these movies are like class of 1999, and it is in direct parallel to like the Y2K panic of like what's going to happen in the year 2000. And so you look to these older kids to be like, oh wow, like I can't wait to graduate from high school, or I can't wait to, you know, meet my love of my life, or, you know, as you refer to your high school crush at that time. But it is really interesting capturing being a certain age at a certain time and these kind of expectations that movies reinforced for all of us, like for our self-concept and like who we thought we needed to be in order to function in the society, which they're not entirely false. It's just interesting. And then really quickly too, I love looking for Y2K clothes thrifting. And I found this pair of Mudd, MUDD, jeans that were lace up on the sides. And granted, I never would have been allowed to wear something like that. They were quite provocative. But then I felt weird because the jeans were actually like a couple sizes too big for me, but they're in junior sizing. So I'm like, these jeans are literally meant for like
kids,
a middle schooler. Yeah, a literal kid. And now they're being packaged for consumption for adults.
Listen, when Euphoria came out, I'm like, shit, guys, like you weren't around. Like 1998. Like I'm glad people examine that now for what it is, right? But like I feel like back in 1999, 2000, like people were not having this conversation really. Like it was just part of the dominant culture. So you accepted this is like the style, this is how people dress. Charlie's Angels, I think, is a good encapsulation of all of that in a lot of ways.
Very of its time.
So I just wanted to go back to Independent Women for a second. I wanted to know who produced the song. You know, it's obviously a song that has been with me for the last 24 years. So I looked it up, and so it's produced by this duo called the Trackmasters. And I wasn't really familiar with that name, but they were like huge in like the mid to late 90s, early 2000s. They did production work for like the Notorious B.I.G. and for Nas. And so it's not like a surprise that they worked with Destiny's Child and that the song is a banger. But like at some point, like people just stopped working with them. Like there's no scandal or anything like that. It's just like, oh, and then the Neptunes came around and everyone just wanted to work with them instead.
That's weird.
Yeah. And usually when you have like that sort of cultural footprint, you know, we've produced for Biggie and we've produced for Nas and Destiny's Child, and we did that R. Kelly and Jay-Z collaboration album. And, you know, you would assume that they would, you know, still be somewhere around on the periphery. And it was just like, nope, Pharrell showed up and everyone stopped working with them.
Yeah, well, you wonder if like the culture just kind of moved on, right? Like there are a lot of songs that are very time capsule-y on the soundtrack, and I think that's one of them. Like, does anything really sound like that even like maybe 5 years later? Like not so much. I feel like that those production trends kind of maybe evaporated a little.
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting because, like, you would assume, you know, with that sort of track record, like, you've got your Timbalands and your Pharrells where it's like, yeah, we still listen to their stuff 20 years later. Maybe they're not as popular as they were at a certain point, right? And they might have tapered off, but, like, you know, you still know those names. But I was like, who are the Trackmasters? And then I looked up what
maybe they retired.
Done, and then
maybe
I was just... Maybe. But it was just kind of interesting to see that they just kind of went out with the trends.
You know what? I really consider the turning point kind of with hip hop music being 2003. That was the first time that I really remembered, wow, hip hop's a thing. Because again, I grew up listening to classic rock. I started listening to Spice Girls and Celine Dion, like exclusively pop stuff. And then when I would watch TRL after school and 50 Cent's Into Club was just like the most massive song. I personally didn't like Eminem. He was a little too violent for me. But
speaking of Eminem, like Y2K like culture.
Well, that's what we're saying. Like this whole period that we're talking about, like the late 90s to early 2000s, that is just like a micro generation in and of itself, because so much, I mean, I think also just the timing with everything that was going on politically at the time, it just was its own little bubble. And then in 2003, when all of these hip hop songs and like Ja Rule and Ashanti, Nelly's Hot in Here, like I can think of so many examples where you see this very, I don't want to call it millennial. I just mean like at the time, like a very millennial era of hip hop versus like the 90s. If the love isn't like 90s R&B, I don't want it. Like it very much went the shift from R&B to hip hop. And that 50 Cent song in particular for me was the turning point of like, oh, this is like the new generation of hip hop. Hip hop is now a mainstream genre instead of a specifically Black artist genre made for Black consumers. I forget what I was, it might have been because I watched Priscilla. Like I was reading about Elvis and stuff, and about, you know, we don't want to get into Elvis too much, but like, you know, how rhythm and blues, like that was a segregated genre, essentially. That's what it started out as. And so you see R&B evolve and gain mainstream popularity. And so you're going to have to bridge and appeal, in quotations, I'm saying, like appeal to all of these mainstream audiences, because what's the idea? To sell as many records as possible. You can't do that if you are only focusing on a particular niche or a particular demographic. You want it to be as widespread as possible. So therefore, I think that was just the stage on which major acts could blow up. And yeah, the sound changes, the attitude changes. Even just like, I'm a huge Missy Elliott fan. So I think of like Missy Elliott and Lil' Kim and just these women artists around the early 2000s who came out and were just, I mean, TLC was a little bit earlier, but I guess like No Scrubs era, you're like, wow. For me, that was something so new and exciting. And I do think that era was like the glue between 90s R&B and then the mid 2000s Timbaland era. And then I think once Timbaland was doing stuff for Justin Timberlake, that to me signaled the completion of the integration of hip hop music into mainstream music.
Yeah, that Justin Timberlake first album for sure, with, you know, Timbaland beats, or you had that Pharrell song where you have the Clips doing a guest verse. You know, these guys who have a whole career just rapping about selling cocaine are on a Justin Timberlake song. It's like his first big single, and you have, you know, these basically street rappers, you know, doing the guest rap on that. And yeah, I mean, I think maybe if you go as far back as, you know, Aaliyah's career with, you know, she did a lot of work with Timbaland, kind of laying that groundwork for hip hop to kind of jump into, you know, pop radio. Because I think for a long time it was very much, you know, segregated as its own thing, and then R&B was still kind of more traditionally sounding, and then you have this really stuttery beat with like a baby crying in the background, and all of a sudden things change, you know.
Yeah, I mean, even in that book, Toxic, that I mentioned, it essentially has a different chapter outlining a woman whose treatment from the media and therefore the public was completely unacceptable. And so we have our usual suspects, right? The Holy Trinity, Brittany, Paris, and Lindsay. But then we also have Aaliyah mentioned in there. We have Janet Jackson. And so I think it's very interesting too that in particular with Aaliyah and Janet Jackson, those are two hyper sexualized Black women. And so that's very emblematic of this early 2000s shift where Aaliyah Aaliyah is a big rabbit hole in terms of how she was positioned and marketed by her family, by the music industry, by some people whose names I will not mention. But yeah, it's really interesting and like, I know some people are like, wow, why do you look back on all this stuff and find out all this info? Doesn't it ruin everything for you? And it's like, no, it doesn't, because you have the distance of time and you have the perspective. And so the more you learn, it doesn't have to ruin those things for you. But at the same time, I think it is important to be thoughtful about these things, because then that's how you have more compassion for people in your own day-to-day life. And that's how pop culture can positively impact you, instead of always listening to a song and being like, why are these lyrics so violent or misogynistic? Or watching a movie and being like, wow, no wonder I have unrealistic expectations of love. Or watching, it's like, we don't have to keep on watching these things over and over and having the same reactions. We can choose to do something different and actually interpret these things in a way that's just better for everybody.
One of the things that's really interesting to me is the thought exercise of how you would maybe reboot Charlie's Angels now, and how this soundtrack would look very different in terms of how it's made up. Because I do feel like, other than in beyond the Beyonce track, like the Destiny's Child track, it's kind of like there's like a female artist like underrepresentation for sure that I think is super reflective of that era. Whereas now, like, you look at the pop landscape and it's dominated by women.
Remember the Charlie's Angels reboot they did do? I never saw it, but it was written and directed by Elizabeth Banks, and then it had Kristen Stewart, and then I actually don't know.
How
Naomi
long ago
Scott,
was that?
Ella
10 years?
Basinka.
15 years?
It was like 5 years ago.
5 years ago.
5 years ago, that made no noise.
No, it didn't. The only song I ever even knew from that movie was Don't Call Me Angel with Ariana Grande, Lana Del Rey, and then who was the third person? Miley Cyrus?
I remember this. So it is an interesting exercise, right? Where like 5 years ago, the new version of this is all the pop girlies that are really kind of dominant in the landscape today, which is different. If you had told me, though, that reboot happened like 15 years ago, because wasn't there also a Charlie's Angels Full Throttle? So there was a sequel.
There was a sequel.
And then a reboot directed by Elizabeth Banks that happened 5 years ago that I think made like very little noise, because I do not remember it.
Well, you know what was disappointing is that when I went to go try to watch this movie, I searched Charlie's Angels and I see it come up. So I click on it, and then the new Charlie's Angels started playing. And I was like, no. I didn't want the 2019 Charlie's Angels. I wanted the original.
It's interesting too, because it's like, I wonder if like a lot of people feel that way, and I wonder how this film is not only remembered but how it's received by people that have not seen it before. If there is kind of a nostalgia thing that happens where if you've never seen this before, this is just like a cool artifact for you. If you're like 25 years old, you live through it, you're like, oh cool, like look at everything being so like bright and fun and happy. I like this. Maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you see the nostalgia for the early 2000s and just you see it. I mean, I see it so much now, where it's the fashion. It is just like being young too. Whereas like, so I was on the RealReal and I found this micro skirt by this brand Kalina Strada, and it's a plaid skirt with like a studded belt, and it's probably like 4 inches 2 inches of fabric. And so I'm like, maybe I'll get it and like wear bike shorts under it or something and like have it be cute for summer. But like there's some 18-year-old girl out there like wearing that as a skirt and like making TikToks about it. And I do think that as much of that, like I think as an adult woman now, you kind of almost want to warn younger women about like how the world works, and the Charlie's Angels effect of like choice feminism and like thinking that like, yeah, but I choose to wear this. And it's like, well, you don't choose how you are perceived in this world because of it. And so I think that, again, when it comes to any of these kind of like systemic issues or complexities, like we can only really scrape the tip of the iceberg here, scrape the surface. But to an extent too, it's not about like just warning these girls or being like, well, their outfits might be cute, but they like, weren't treated the way they should or whatever. They were objectified. Like then you come off as like the old grandma, like shaking her fist in the air. And so it's more about like how we have compassion for people who maybe like don't understand the like crazy body image like issues that stemmed from growing up as a teenager in the 2000s. Like we can just be like, you know what? Good for them that they actually haven't had that struggle. They might have a different set of struggles with, the proliferation of technology and growing up on social media. Like those are whole different problems that they're going to adapt to as well. And I think if we just try to change the way that like we carry ourselves in general, instead of like everyone's so easy now to hop on the internet and like comment on someone they don't know's video. And it's like, dude, if you're spending your time doing that, you're not spending your time like actually making the world a better place. I'm not saying everyone is obligated to do that, but I'm a little bit of an optimist. So I like to think that when you know better, you do better. Most people don't, but I like to think that they could. Life lessons from Charlie's Angels soundtrack.
I mean, my main lesson was like, wow, good for them for finding so many songs that have angel in the lyrics.
On the nose.
Real beat.
Stuck to the theme.
I think that is a great thought to end this conversation on. So thank you so much, Nicole, for being on the podcast.
Of course. Thank you guys for having me. I had fun with you.
Yeah, I had fun talking about Charlie's Angels. While we may not recommend you watch it, it was a very fun conversation.
Meant it in good faith, but like super fun to talk about. Maybe we'll make another podcast about that Abercrombie disco underwear store.
Yeah, maybe we'll do a bonus episode.
I have a Spotify playlist. That's called Gilly Hicks. I forget exactly what I named it, but it's basically like the actual songs. Wow. Because I had written them down because I don't even think we had Shazam in those days. So I just kind of like wrote down the songs and then I made a mix CD of them for my coworkers.
Oh, Nicole's
because I'm insane.
I literally am. I'm going to look it up immediately.
Yay! You're going to love it.
I'm so excited.
So if our listeners want to check out your podcast or if they want to follow your newsletter, what is the best way for them to find you?
Definitely. So the podcast, you can listen to it on any platform. You can watch it on Spotify and YouTube. On YouTube, it's at Nicstalgia. And then my newsletter that goes out every week, it's very fun, just musings about pop culture. And you can find that at nicstalgia.substack.com. And then I'm at Nicole Tremaglio on like every social media platform possible, it seems.
Well, very cool. And of course, you can find us at SoundtrackCast on Instagram and Twitter because we're not going to call it X. And everyone we have on this podcast all agrees. We just call it Twitter.
Isn't it still twitter.com?
Yeah, you still technically have to go to www.twitter.com. So you will not catch me finding it X as long as I can.
Well, thank you again and have a good rest of your week.